Regarding validation seeking, if validation seeking is trying to get input from other people, other sources, other than our own thinking and what we observe, and our intuition, if it's trying to get more certainty from other sources before acting, before making a decision, then we could have gone down the rabbit hole and lost so much of our self-trust. So why might we have so little self-trust and turn to, quote, other sources to increase our certainty level before acting? In other words, there is actually a theory or body of theory in mathematics called decision-making under conditions of uncertainty. Well, it strikes me lately that a better way of looking at that perhaps is to think that all decisions are made under conditions of uncertainty if you consider that some say there's no such thing even as a fact, only degrees of certainty. Everything is a hypothesis or conjecture. And so that being perhaps the first step, to realize that we're all acting all the time on something less than certain. And if we're going to look for facts or factoids or pieces of information entirely certain as to their accuracy, and not act until that is achieved, then that's the first problem, I think. The next is perhaps our default mode. Dr. Eric Berne, a psychoanalyst from the 1960s, had once come out with a book, I'm Okay, You're Okay. And he talked of 4 mindsets, and 2 in particular that grabbed my attention were, you're okay, I'm not okay. And that could be applied to how we view our knowledge sources, I believe, and in turn our degree of self-confidence in what we perceive, what we think, versus what other people say or tell us, market to us even. So some people are of the mindset, problematically perhaps, that in a question of who tends to be more right on average, their default switch might be set to others are usually right and I'm usually wrong, or they usually know more than I do. This then doubly problematic, I think, given our society, our times, maybe large parts of the world these days, who find it advantageous to gain a foothold in various ways by putting on a degree of certainty that is not warranted when they talk. Hence there even being advice to pretend, to fake it till you make it, and to strive to be the expert in your field and communicate that, and not show your flaws, the chinks in your armor, lest people deem you not to be an expert and abandon you for purposes of purchasing your product or simply listening to you as a friend, neighbor, parent, etc. Dr. Robert Trivers, for instance, has talked of this in various forms, including one of his books, The Folly of Fools, talking about how self-deception can be very advantageous to some people if they convince themselves they're right or highly certain about anything when they're not. Then that can be a great marketing tool to others in turn, for then you will look far less deceptive as to how you come off if you believe you're correct on one level of consciousness, that is. I would also add at this point, there is a fascinating book entitled Thou Shalt Not Be Aware. And furthermore, it has come to my attention over the years, from personal observation, reading, and videos, that many a person who is frail or otherwise physically unempowered compared to some people will tend, I believe, to go into the default mode of you're right, I'm wrong, or you're okay, I'm not okay, and suffer greatly in terms of lack of confidence over their perceptions, etc., their reasoning, and so on. And sadly, it being then an all-or-nothing thing. The basic reality of this, in my mind at least, I'm not sure what Eric Burns says, being that if you feel yourself very vulnerable, physically speaking, as a child, then you probably will kowtow, you probably will find yourself easily coerced to believe whatever someone else tells you. And if a parent, say, or someone else in your life says that at the same time they're treating you rather harshly or more, that they love you, that they care for you greatly and have your best interest in heart, and yet it doesn't seem to add up that way as to what you've experienced from them on the doing level, or the unconsciously or otherwise perceived level in terms of facial gestures and intonation of voice, then I believe one would default, out of fear of injury or death even, from physical matters, outpowered that way and all, by frailty, yes, as a child in general compared to the size of a parent, but especially a frail child, or often a female child. This being very much then shifting one, I believe, into default mode of I'm wrong, you're right, or you're okay and I'm not okay. Especially if added in, one is isolated as a child from contact with other children, telling them what they think of their parents in turn, and maybe what they think of your parents. And hence, some children having great animosity for their parents and disrespect of the parents' claims to be perfect and highly loving, other children just the opposite. Following again, I believe, along two lines of the degree of frailty of a child first, compared to other children their age and gender and size, etc., and secondly, how isolated is the child from comments about the parents from outside sources. It not helping any if the isolation is due in part to moving all the time, such that one doesn't develop friendships very quickly and sustainably, and then therein alone not hearing various comments about a parent or parents. Now it strikes me too from my personal life, another problem in self-trust is a failure to be able to evaluate other people, because perhaps a kinder, more empathetic person might not want to use words off the shelf, words in the dictionary thus, to describe people and traits of people, whereupon, in my opinion, my reasoning, most all words in the dictionary describing people tend to be what Dr. David D. Burns, the psychologist, or rather medical doctor, psychiatrist, had said in Feeling Good, the new mood therapy, that we should be cautious not to use labels. And in my opinion, most all words in the dictionary are labels, i.e. derogatory terms that generate anger, blame, frustration, misevaluation in general. And depending then on whether one is empathetic or not, one falls in a line one way or the other as to use terminology of this sort, without which you have a very difficult time sorting people out and evaluating them. Yes, scriptures in the Bible of the Christian faith say, for instance, judge not, lest you be judged yourself. And yet, without judging in terms of even use of derogatory terms, how can one sort things out? How can one winnow the wheat from the chaff? Whether one is viewing the wheat and the chaff in positive fashion or negative derogatory fashion, the matter is still the question of can you sort the wheat from the chaff, the advantageous to you from the non-advantageous, whether you have respect for them, hate them, love them, blame them, or not. So those more empathetic find themselves, I believe, behind the 8-ball right there. And if having a parent commenting to a child that their word choice is hostile or blameful or not tolerant or too hard on others, then that right there also stymieing a child from evaluating anyone outside of the family, let's say, on the grounds that the words used, while helping to discriminate types of people, friend from foe, you might say, advantageous and not, are said by a parent to be harsh. And maybe the parent, in turn, would prefer to be taken, so to speak, to the cleaners than have hostile feelings toward those taking them to the cleaners and being a victim over and over and over again, rather than hate the person involved and people in general as they sort them out one way or the other. A very real issue, I believe. Finally, perhaps we lack self-trust because we have several other factors at play. Maybe we have a hard time learning from experience, such that the school of hard knocks gives us information where we misevaluated people, where we, you might call, made errors or had flaws in our reasoning. Yet if you don't write it down and review it, for lack of the capacity to write well or with clarity, or if you don't have time to review or even appreciate the concept of review as necessary, then how can we learn from our experiences and in turn develop beyond whatever bad premises we were taught, including certain denials from childhood, let alone our outside environment as an adult? And so, how can we learn without the skills to learn, including writing things down to remember them and reviewing them, as well as writing things down to refine our concepts in general? Very problematic once again. Taking notes alone, by the way, very almost useless if not reviewed. Finally, if we think that we have little cause for self-trust of ourselves compared to others because we are estimating others to be happier than we are by way of their yardstick for happiness, not ours, that too, I believe, can send us down the rabbit hole right there. For instance, I was once in therapy with an individual 20 or more years ago, and I had at one point said to him, I trust most everything you say because you have much more money coming in than I do. And yet, arguably, looking back years later, decades later, I see that he had not helped me one iota, and in fact, overall had been quite harmful. I would have been far better off on my own, somehow. Yet, because he had more money coming in than me, had a, quote, job and I didn't, and other factors, his married and mine not, his having children, mine not, his having a job title, mine not, his having a PhD, mine not. I deemed him on all of these accounts to surely have been happier than me, ignoring certain key factors that said otherwise to my mind and gut feeling. Noting finally that years later he had a massive heart attack and was out of work 6 months, and he had a youth of 18 or more years of age that was in a career quite questionable to me honor-wise, as to how that individual made money. Also, a rather disingenuous smile, and if I didn't mention a weight of at least 500 pounds, which of course contributed to the massive heart attack. And so you might say he had all these drugs of choice and was misrepresenting to me, first of all, who he was on all levels, and secondly, I deemed him happy just on the basis of these superficial traits like the amount of money and marital status, having children, job title, all the things that supposedly give us reputation, shall we say, and status in certain circles. Had he been a plumber with an income of $5,000 a year, living in a car, at night at least for sleeping purposes, I suppose I would have thought twice, 3 times, 4 times about having a default mode of his being happier than me and knowing a lot more than me also. That then a very interesting phenomenon too, I believe. Let alone others claiming in their manner of diction and how they comport themselves in general to be super confident, faced with me, a person who deems himself to be skeptical both of others and himself now when it comes to being too certain. Call it dogmatic, if you will. All reasons then, I think, why it is possible for us to not have as much confidence as we ought to. Hence also may be covered in part by the term imposter syndrome feelings.